Welcome to Lesson 2 of Section 6 of the BJCP Training Program from the Brewers Anonymous Homebrew Club. We are officially starting our look at the brewing process in this section, and we are taking a look at the first few steps of the process in something that can be roughly subcategorized as mashing steps. I can already foresee in the future the comments that are going to be left on this video blasting me that there are mashing steps. Mash is its own thing. The other things I'm talking about are not technically mashing steps, and that's true. That is actually correct. But what this lesson is going to look at is the things that we prepare for mashing, what we do in mashing, and what we do to get us out of that mashing phase and into the boil. So even though not everything in this process has the word mashing in it, we've, as I said, roughly categorized this. Sure, that won't stop the comments, but I did my best. All right, so let's start that discussion. And the first thing that we're going to do is the milling step. So what are we milling? Well, technically, the very first thing we did was decide to brew a beer. And then I guess the second official thing we did is decide what beer we're going to brew. Now we're physically going into the process of it. So now what we're doing is that we are going to weigh out all the ingredients, particularly the malted barley, that we're going to need to make the beer that we've decided to brew. Now, nearly every recipe is comprised of a very large percentage of base malts. And by base malts, I'm talking about pale malt, Pilsner, Maris Otter, just to name a few examples. These are the most common ones that may be mentioned on the exam or anywhere in this process or anywhere in the ingredients in the style comparisons, but they're also not the only ones. But we will discuss that more as we get into those sections of this program. To that, specialty malts are typically added, and these are malts that have been kilned, roasted, or modified for a specific result. The types of specialty malts that are added are based on what color, flavor, aroma, and body the brewer is trying to produce. And again, that varies widely, and another thing that we will talk about as we go on. Once those malts have been weighed and prepared, we need to get the starches that are inside of those grain kernels. And to do that, we mill the grains. A typical grain mill is a multi-roller machine that breaks apart the husk, releasing those starches that we need to convert to sugars to make beer. At the same time, it's doing this just enough to keep those husks relatively intact to act as our grain bed that lets the water freely flow through what is now called our grist and also acts as a filter bed. Now, as a side note, there's a bit more to the structure of the malt grain, and there's more to talk about with those starches and even the husks. And we're going to cover that in the ingredients section that is focused on malts. So kind of just I'm sure these first few slides are already raising questions. Kind of put those questions in the back of your head. They'll very likely be answered in some upcoming sections. So here's what one of many models of mills may look like at a local brewery. They're going to be far different in a macro brewery like an Anheuser-Busch or a Coors, but your local brewery might have something that looks a bit like this. Your home brewer may have something that looks more like this. There's not a terrible difference in terms of mechanics. They both have a hopper that feeds the grains into spinning rollers that crack open the grains. The commercial one is designed to mill hundreds of pounds of grains at a time, while the home version is made to do like 10, 12, 20, maybe even several passes through, depending on what recipe you're making. And both commercial brewers and home brewers may have something between these two. There's actually several options when it comes to buying a grain mill that fits your needs. So now going into mashing. While we're weighing out and milling those grains, we've also been heating up and adding water to our mash tun, and we're about ready to mash in at this point. And mashing in is as simple as adding our milled grains to hot water. This hot water is going to convert those starches into fermentable sugars. Now, the temperature of that water is going to vary on what result we want. A lower temperature converts these starches into less complex sugars that are going to be easily converted into alcohol in the fermentation process. That leaves a lighter body, typically more crisp and drier beer. The higher the temperature, the more complex those sugar chains become, and they're a little harder for the yeast to fully consume, and we start to get some residual sugars, some bigger flavors, and a fuller body. Again, these are generalizations, and these are things that we're going to talk about when we talk specifically about malts and mashing later on in future sections. Apart from just adding the malts to the water, which would be defined as a single infusion mash, there's also step mashes where you adjust the temperature along the way. There's also decoction mashes where you remove part of your mash, get it to a boil to raise your overall temperature. And there's other mash techniques for more specific results. And again, we'll talk more about that when we cover malts and mashing specifically. The addition of our grist to the water and the conversion of starches to sugars is done in a mash tun. And nearly every single version of brewing has some form of a mash tun, both commercially and in homebrewing. Even homebrewers that do a brew in the bag single pot method, when the bag is in that hot water converting those sugars, at that moment and that time, that pot is a mash tun. This is almost, if not, a universal step to all brewing processes. Of course, there's exceptions to every rule, but this is one of the ones where it's almost universal. And again, we have a couple examples. This version is one of many versions of a commercial mash tun you might see. And here are only a very few, just a couple examples of a homebrewer mash tun. There are so many more. Basically, anything that's food safe and can maintain temperatures or be temperature controlled can be used as a mash tun. Our next step in our process that we are laying out here in this introduction is lautering. Once we've converted our starches to sugars, it's time to lauter. And in this process, we're going to learn some terms that I can almost guarantee will appear somewhere on your entrance exam. Starting with lautering itself. Lautering is the process of removing the liquid from the grist. Now, this liquid, the sugar water from the conversion process during that mash, it's no longer called water. It is now called wort. That is a word I can really guarantee is going to appear somewhere in a question on your entrance exam. So it's good to define that now. The liquid that we have made in the mash tun is called wort, and it's only going to be wort until we add yeast. Then it starts turning into beer. But right now, up until that point, we are now working with wort. Now, during that process, there's often some broken husk or other solids from the malt kernels that can remain in suspension, but those can be filtered out by recirculating the wort through the grain bed. This is called vorlofing. This is another word that may be on your exam. So at this point, after having recirculated, or I should go ahead and just say after vorlofing our wort, the grain bed never completely runs dry, so there's still a considerable amount of wort clinging to the grain bed. A common practice to reclaim that remaining wort is to rinse the grains with hot water, but not so hot that it partially cooks the husk, but just hot enough to rinse those grains. And this is called sparging, another term very likely to be on your exam. On the homebrew level, you can lauter with the mash tun simply by draining it and then running sparge water over the remaining grain bed. This isn't as practical, and in some cases, it's even impossible for commercial levels to do this, and often commercial breweries will have a separate vessel called a lauter tun. So this is an example of a lauter tun that a brewery might have in their brew house. Conversely, here are some of the ways to lauter our beer on the homebrew level. There are specifically made devices like you see in the upper left-hand corner. There's kind of more homemade devices in the next two slides, and you can even just get some kind of vessel to hold your hot water and pour over the grain bed. That's actually what I find myself doing. I have a couple of sparging devices, but I just find pouring hot water manually saves me a lot of time and a lot of packing and unpacking equipment. So now we have collected all of our wort. We've gotten as much as we can off those grains from lautering. We've also done a proper vorlof before that to make sure it's as clear as it can be as it goes into the boil kettle. And we are on to the boil. So that is what we're going to talk about next in the next lesson. So I will see you there.